So far, we've talked about the visualization of satellite data, focusing on this multispectral data that comes from Landsat satellites or Landsat sensors. Basically, what we've seen so far is that each one of these pixels has a reflectance value, which is how bright that pixel is. We can combine different bands to get like a false color image or a true color image, and we can even create indices like NDVI to visualize these images in a different way. But if you were to like zoom in on any individual pixel using any of these techniques and you wanted to click on what the value of that pixel is, so far with what we've seen, we're going to get a number no matter what. The only value we have in each of these locations is a number. What we really want to know when we're looking at pictures of the Earth is what exists where. Just visualizing these images doesn't give us that information. We have to do some analysis on these images to get be able to get an idea of what exists where. We have to use one of a number of different methods that exist to convert that number that is based on brightness within each one of these pixels to basically a category or a name or an object of what that pixel actually is. Either what it's made up of, or if it is a part of a larger object, what is that object? So we use these different processes that fit into this umbrella of image classification techniques. Image classification is defined as the process of assigning pixels to classes based on the values of reflectance that we start with. So each pixel has those values for each of the bands we're using. Pixels with similar values are likely going to be of the same class. So we want to figure out what group of values, how similar do they have to be, what range of values is going to qualify a pixel for being in one group versus another group. There's several different ways to do this, to differentiate these similar pixels. Or to differentiate classes, which are these groups of pixels. We can have unsupervised classification. This is where the clusters are largely discovered by computers using just automated algorithms. In a supervised classification, we outline areas based on on-the-ground knowledge. So we actually have to have some understanding of what actually exists in a place to delineate what different areas are made up of. Finally, we have object-based classification. This is a newer methodology. This is focused on delineating areas of similar features. This object-based classification actually results in vector output rather than raster output. So it's a little bit different. So I'm going to discuss a couple of the methodologies for conducting each of these types of classifications, what's involved in actually carrying out a classification, and being able to say what exists where in human terms rather than just having those numbers that are assigned by a computer based on brightness. An important concept to look at to be able to better understand these classification techniques is the concept of an item spectral signature. Any object that exists in the world has a spectral signature, and it's basically this measure of, at all different wavelengths within the visible spectrum or the near-infrared part of the spectrum, how much does that object reflect light in that part of the spectrum? So this would be something you measure on the ground. You can determine these values experimentally for any particular object. So that percentage reflectance, or how much an individual object reflects in different parts of the spectrum, can be graphed like these graphs shown on the slide here. So on the y-axis we have percentage reflectance. That's how much of the light that hits an object in a specific part of the spectrum actually gets reflected back away. And on the bottom we have wavelength. Remember, wavelength is related to the different parts of the spectrum, different types of light like visible light, infrared. So what we're looking at here is basically the visible part of the spectrum starting at about 0.4 micrometers, moving up into the lower energy part of the spectrum with those longer wavelength, lower energy waves. So if we look at something like silty water, this is the line that basically is at the bottom here. Silty water isn't a very good reflector in general. If you shine light into water, and especially into silty water, that light can transmit a ways into it. It can be absorbed by the water. Not a whole lot is reflected. So water is actually a pretty bad reflector at all wavelengths, but it's a little bit better, just between 0.5 and 0.6 than other areas. That corresponds roughly to like the bluish part of the spectrum. That makes sense since we see water as blue. That means the water is actually reflecting that blue light. The spectral signature, it's going to be mostly blue that's being reflected. Then if we look at something like pine woods, that's basically a pine forest, an evergreen forest. It's going to have a lot of reflectance in the green part of the spectrum. And as I've mentioned a couple times, usually green photosynthetic vegetation also reflects a lot in the infrared part of the spectrum. We just can't see it. The spectral signature is a little bit different. There's very little reflectance in those smaller wavelengths, but as you get up to that area around green, around just before 0.6 micrometers, you get like a massive spike in the reflectance. Again, that makes sense. We see pine woods as green. That's mostly what is being reflected by pine woodland. The reflectance kind of drops after green as you're moving to longer wavelengths, and it drops off quite a bit at the red part of the spectrum, but then jumps up again in that infrared part of the spectrum. It's lower than in the visible part of the spectrum, but it's a lot higher than that surrounding area and then that red part of the spectrum right before it. Grasslands have a pretty interesting signature, and the signature actually helps explain why that NDVI calculation is so useful. Grasslands are actually pretty low in most of the visual part of the spectrum. They get higher in those yellow and reddish parts of the spectrum, but then they really peak in the near infrared part of the spectrum that's just beyond the visible part of the spectrum. So around like 0.8 to 0.9 micrometers, grasslands have a really high reflectance value. So a related concept that's really important in discussing classification techniques is the concept of feature space. So this is essentially a graph of reflectance over 2, 3, or more bands. It gets really complicated to visualize this in 3 or more bands. Looking at feature space in 2 bands clarifies the concept quite a bit. So if you're just looking at 2 bands and comparing an object's reflectance in those 2 bands, you can plot the amount of reflectance in each of these bands on a graph, where the y-axis is one of these bands, the x-axis is another one of these bands. At the left side of the figure, in the bottom right of the slide, we have this 2-dimensional feature space. Band 1 has its magnitude and reflectance value graphed on the x-axis. Band 2 has that value on the y-axis. And for every pixel in your scene, in that raster, you can see over these 2 different bands what the characteristics of that pixel are. It might be high in maybe near infrared and low in red, or vice versa. So what that means, if you plot every single pixel in your raster dataset using these 2 bands, there'll be big groups of pixels that have similar values within these 2 bands. They'll have similar band 2 value and similar band 1 value. In this feature space, all those pixels will clump together if you graph all those pixels together. If you use just one band, you might not differentiate things very well. You might have something that is really high in near infrared, but low in red, and another thing that's high in near infrared and high in red. If you're just looking at near infrared, they look the same on the raster, but if you look at them in feature space and graph these out, they'll have 2 distinct clumps. A lot of times when we're using remote sensing data, we're actually looking at 3 bands, so a lot of times the classification is done based on 3 bands as well. If you use 3 bands, you can use this 3-dimensional feature space. The same basic idea exists. You graph the reflectance at each of these 3 bands along a different axis, and you end up with 3-dimensional clouds of these pixel values. So instead of just looking at like the near infrared and the red, as I mentioned on the last slide, you might also add in green into the mix. So pixels that have similar values for all 3 of those will show up in kind of a cloud together in the same area in this 3-dimensional feature space. So if you have a bunch of pine forest, for instance, and you're measuring it at 3 different wavelengths for these 3 different bands, you'd expect those 3 bands to be pretty similar. So classification is basically identifying areas on these graphs, on these feature spaces, that are clustered, that have similar values for all pixel types. So really the challenge in classification is deciding where to draw the boundaries around these groups. So if you have 2-dimensional feature space, you're going to have every single pixel graph according to the 2 bands that you're looking at, and you have to figure out where to draw those circles around those dots. If you're in 3-dimensional feature space, again, you have like a cloud. It's a little more complicated because you have 3 different variables. You have to decide where to draw the boundaries of that cloud around that group of cells. So all these different types of classification I'm going to talk about, starting with unsupervised classification, basically refer to different ways of drawing these circles or boundaries around specific groups of pixels that look similar to one another or that have similar reflectance characteristics to one another. The first type of classification I'm going to talk about, and by far the easiest type of classification to implement, is what's called unsupervised classification. A lot of times it's a classification we use to kind of start out with land cover analysis and to better understand the raster data that we're starting with. With unsupervised classification, different software types use different types of algorithms, but basically each of these different types of software uses different algorithms to separate the image into classes without user input based on the input bands. So the computer decides what classes are related and divides them into separate classes into the output data. So on the left, we have NDVI visualized. Again, that's that index of photosynthetic vegetation, showing areas of a lot of near infrared as like really bright green and areas with low values for near infrared in other colors. If we throw that into an unsupervised classification algorithm in some type of remote sensing software or in ArcGIS, and we say we want 10 classes, the computer, whatever algorithm it's using, tries to divide those classes up as best as possible, and you get an output like what's seen on the right. If you'll notice, there's 10 different classes, just like you asked for, but we don't know what those different classes are. They're just numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Unsupervised classification doesn't tell you what each of these things is. You have to go in and figure out like which pixel on the ground corresponds to what group and what that on the ground class really looks like. So unsupervised classification, this is where a computer uses some sort of algorithm to split up those pixels in the feature space based on the specified number of classes that you want. ArcGIS uses an unsupervised classification algorithm called ISO cluster analysis. So you have to generate ISO clusters, which are basically just clusters of similar values in feature space. So you can see these clusters in the bottom left. This is, remember, two-dimensional feature space. We're looking at two different bands. When you launch one of these classifiers, you have to say, I want to do this on NDVI, which would be one band like in the last slide, or you can say, I want to do this on band 1 and band 2, and classify based on those inputs. So with the generation of ISO clusters and using ISO clusters to classify data, you have this iterative process where first the computer generates the straight line out at that 45-degree angle, where you see these numbers of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. All the black dots, all the bigger black dots, not those little black dots, but the bigger ones, refer to individual pixels. With the first iteration of this process, basically every pixel is clumped according to which mean value along that line it's closest to. So these groups on the left, these aren't final clusters. This is like the very first round of the generation of clusters because it's an iterative process. We have 5 different classes in this case, class 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And for each of those big circles, those are representative of pixels. Those are each grouped together with the value that they're closest to along that line. Once each of those groups is created, the average value for each of those groups is created. And that's what's shown on the right graph down here. So we have showing those average values, mean class points for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now from these mean values, again, all the actual locations where these cells fall on feature class are clumped according to which mean value they're closest to. And again, this is an iterative process. This may change the classification of some of these pixels. This iteration and reclassification will continue until you get the optimal configuration of these classes that minimizes the difference between those mean points and all the pixels within that cluster. Now, a couple other things happen. If statistics of two groups end up really near together, those groups can get merged together into one class. Likewise, as this is happening, clusters with very few values can get eliminated. So you can actually set a cutoff. If you have like a small cluster with just a couple values, it just gets eliminated. Those pixels end up being brought into the next closest group. So what you end up with is based on the spectral characteristics of whatever bands you're inputting into this unsupervised classification algorithm, you'll get an output that has clusters with consistent characteristics. In practice, when you're carrying this out in ArcGIS, most of this occurs behind the scenes. All you really do is a two-step process where first you generate these ISO clusters. That gives you a classifier, which basically says what group looks like what. After generating the ISO clusters, you use the mean values of those ISO clusters to actually classify the image that you want to classify. Finally, with unsupervised classification, you usually have to reclassify the output because, again, the computer doesn't know what each of these things are. You might end up with groups that are actually showing you the same thing, that have actually classified the same thing as two different groups, and you might want to combine those to a single group in your output. You're also going to have to determine what those different output classes are. So you're going to have to look at some sort of ground truth data or some sort of better picture of the real world and be able to say class 1, I'm pretty sure that's water. I'm going to say that first class is a class showing water. At right, we have an example of the output of an unsupervised classification. This is in the area around Morro Bay, California. It looks like bands 2, 3, and 4 were used. If you're using Landsat 8, those would be the visible part of the spectrum. Landsat 7, that would include that infrared band. And we used 15 clusters, so we wanted 15 different output classes. That's quite a few, so you'd probably have to reclassify if you have that many clusters. So let's look at what these are. So again, with the output of unsupervised classification, you don't know what any of these clusters are. You're going to have to compare what these different groups are with what exists on the original satellite image, or preferably with what exists on a higher resolution satellite image than what you started with if you're using Landsat. We can make a few assumptions here just looking at this example. That dark blue, that's definitely ocean, that's offshore right there. That looks like it's cluster 1. Cluster 1, we could just say that's ocean or water. That's like open water. Then there's that pinkish reddish area. That also looks like it's open water. A lot of times coasts kind of mess up classifications. A lot of times you get waves and light reflecting in different directions, which make that narrow coastal strip often classified as something else. But that reddish pink, that looks like maybe it's cluster 8. I think maybe cluster 8. We'd probably just classify that as water as well. So you'd want to reclassify those when you get to it. Cluster 1 and cluster 8, you'd want to put them together in an open water class. Then we have that bright green strip. That's certainly going to be sand. There's a pretty big beach along this whole strip of coastline just around Morro Bay. So that bright green, which looks like cluster 14, we can just name that as beach by looking at this. So you want to go through each of these clusters, try to determine what is what. You may want to combine classes, and you also might want to determine which classes aren't reliable. There might be some overlapping classes. While unsupervised classification is a good first crack at this type of analysis, when you don't have reliable field data or on-the-ground data, what you really want to aspire to when you're conducting classification is what's called a supervised classification. This is where you use known characteristics of classes to conduct this classification. The characteristics become known through the delineation of training sites. So instead of an automated algorithm to look for similar groups, you actually define what similar groups are. So we find areas that we know for sure are of a certain class, and we can actually outline them and create what's called a training site. So training sites are these areas collected for each class where we have actually known values about what that class belongs to. So we might go to a sports field, outline that and say this is grass. Or we might go to a shopping mall and say this is an urban area, or a forest, outline an area of forest and say we know for sure this is forest. After you collect these training sites, delineate where these known areas are, you have to get a handful for each of the classes that you want in your output data set. Then the workflow is actually pretty similar to unsupervised classification. Once you figure out what the classes are, you save a file with class ranges. This is your signature file. And then you use that signature file that basically has the characteristics of each class, those average values for each of the bands you're using, and you conduct a classification of that raster based on that signature file. This is fairly simple to carry out, but like the unsupervised classification, there's kind of a lot more going on behind the scenes. And for supervised classification, there's actually a number of different algorithms that you can choose from that all use different mathematical or statistical methods to actually go from those characteristics of the signature file to classifying each individual pixel in the entire image. So I'm going to mention a couple of these that you might come across if you're conducting some basic remote sensing analysis. Before going in depth into those different algorithms, I want to just show a couple examples of training site collection, because that's a really important step in conducting a supervised classification. So here in this image in the bottom right, we have a number of different areas being collected for a number of different land cover types. It looks like those areas surrounded in pink are kind of scrubby shrub areas. The areas outlined in green are more just kind of lawn, grassy areas. The areas in dark blue look like they're open water, and the areas in green are kind of marshy areas. So you want to be able to find large areas for each class that you want to classify over the entire extent of your study area. So this is an example of collecting this type of data using higher resolution than something like a Landsat. You can collect this data using higher resolution data or by collecting this data in the field. So you can actually go out and delineate areas with a GPS that belong to a certain class and load that back in. Once you identify these sites, you can calculate the spectral signature of radiance for that class, which is basically the mean value and the variance within that value, so how much above or below the mean you want to include for each of these bands. So again, like we're going to classify based on multiple bands. Each pixel is going to have a value for each band, and it's going to get classified based on how close it is to each of these classes that we're delineating. All right, so different classifiers exist. Maximum likelihood classification is the historically most commonly used one. There's a lot of new classifiers being developed and used more and more, but maximum likelihood is really important to know about just because it's been around for a really long time. So remember, what each of these classifiers is basically doing is taking one of those pixels from your raster and trying to determine, based on all those areas you delineated, based on like known real-world locations, which group that you delineated that pixel belongs to. So maximum likelihood uses the statistical distribution of each class to determine probabilities that each cell belongs to each class. So we have a fairly simple two-dimensional version of this at the left, where we basically have the frequency distribution of values in two different classes. So class A, let's say this is like an area of grass. You delineated all these areas of grass, and with all those different pixels that were designated as definitely known to be grass, the average reflectance in just one of these bands would be at the peak of that hump that's labeled class A. There's fewer and fewer of those places that you knew for sure were grass that are like really far above or really far below the middle of that hump. Likewise, class B, we might have like a forest. So forest is going to have a different reflectance, different signature than grass. If you delineated all these areas of forest based on known values, you knew a forest was there, the average reflectance value would be like in the middle of that big hump with class B. There's fewer values as you get further from that average value. So using this known value, like the average reflectance for A, average reflectance for B, the classifier would go through every pixel in your raster and try to figure out what's more likely, that this cell or this pixel is going to belong to class A or to class B. Usually it'll be a pretty easy decision, especially with separation like this. It's going to be pretty easy to tell what's grass and what's forest. You might get some forest areas, however, that look kind of lighter like grass, or some grassy areas that might look darker like forest, or even a pixel that's like a mix of the two. So you can really get something that's half grass, half forest, because the pixels are so big. You'll end up with a pixel that's just kind of a mixed color. That's where things get difficult. That's basically this overlapping area between class A and class B. So none of these classifiers are perfect. And honestly, if you get like an 85% success rate, that's actually a really good classification output. So they're classified based on which class they're most likely to belong to, but generally there are going to be mistakes. So at right, we have a slightly more complicated example. This is using two different bands instead of one. When we have two bands, we graph not just on frequency, but on the actual values of reflectance for each of those bands. Based on the known values you identified, we get those dots that represent the average values for that class. In this case, we have grass, sand, and water, kind of representing these three different extremes. These have very different reflectance values. Moving out from those average values, we actually have those standard deviational ellipses, basically going out and saying, as you get this far away from the known average value for sand, it gets less and less likely that a pixel with those values are going to be actually sand. Likewise, same with grass. So as you get further away from that dot in the middle of the grass class, it's less likely something's going to be grass. So ultimately, every pixel is going to have to be classified into one of these groups. So based on these probability distributions for these different classes, the maximum likelihood classifier will come up with these red lines, which are basically the boundaries in this feature space. If we have an area like that dot in the middle that isn't clearly grass, sand, or water, based on where it falls with regard to those red lines, it ends up being classed as sand because it's more likely to be sand than water or grass. It might not actually be sand, but the classifier says it's sand because the values are most closely related to those values for sand. Usually every single pixel is going to be classified in your output raster, but you can actually fill low confidence cells with no data values. That cell that's labeled by P and then in parentheses XY, that's going to be a really low confidence, low probability cell where you're not really sure which one it actually belongs to. So you could fill this with no data if you want. And also with maximum likelihood classifier output, you can also output a confidence raster. And that shows you for each cell, what's the confidence that it's in the correct classification. So if a cell is more closely located near like the actual mean values where each of these dots are, then it'll really have high confidence because it's really close to like the known mean values for that class. If it's further away, it's going to be lower confidence. And you can look at like the levels of confidence for different areas in your output. There are other supervised classifiers that are based on machine learning, things like random trees, which are also called random forest or decision trees. These work a little differently. They narrow down the possible classifications based on the data point features, not just simply on using statistical methods, but using kind of these cutoffs that are determined through an iterative process. So like random trees uses different pixel subsets to figure out efficient decision trees, which like best separate the values into individual groups based on your known input values. There are other advanced classification methods too. Some of these are called support vector machine or neural networks. Support vector machine, for instance, needs generally fewer input samples, and they can work on training samples that aren't as effectively distributed around a mean value. All these more advanced machine learning classifiers operate kind of as black boxes. It's kind of difficult to actually like have much control over them. So it's a little easier to understand what's going on with like maximum likelihood classification. Once one of these decision trees or random forests is created, you can actually look at the decisions that were made for pixels. So if you're using a couple different bands and you're using NDVI, you can classify based on these decision trees. So through the iterative process, these random forests will actually come up with like the decision hierarchy where you start with like, where you basically narrow down on what class the pixel will belong to. So with that very first decision, each pixel is assessed for whether the NDVI is greater than 0 or less than 0. If it's less than 0, it's water. That's it. Then the next decision that's made by this classifier is whether the NDVI is greater than 0.4 or less than 0.4. If you follow that yes branch, you eventually get to like different types of forest, mangrove, rubber. If you have a value that's less than 0.4, you follow that no, and you end up with unvegetated or this other type of forest, which might be like a deciduous forest or less photosynthetic forest because it has lower NDVI. Regardless of the classifier used, the supervised classification output looks a lot like that unsupervised classification output as well. What's convenient about it is you don't really have to reclassify. You've already grouped together categories that are distinct categories in the real world. And you've already named those categories as well. So once you have a supervised classification output, you're already a couple steps ahead from where you would have been with an unsupervised classification. So as this example shows, you already have all the categories you want. You can reclassify them if you want, but you probably don't have to because you would have already thought through what the important categories are. So far, the methods we've looked at are called pixel-based methods. They use these square pixels as input and output. Object-based classification is this other type of classification that's really growing in prominence as we get better and better quality raster data and better quality remote sensing data. This type of classification groups pixels into representative shapes and sizes. So we identify actual features and not just the class they belong to. We use things like shape, size, as well as spectral properties to classify an image. So in an image, we might see like trees and buildings being identified as trees and buildings, not just being identified as like urban land cover or forest land cover. So even though this is a really cool technology that has a lot of capabilities, it's not something you'd always want to use. Generally, this object-based classification is better for the high-resolution data. In cases where you have many pixels that make up one object, it makes sense because those pixels basically get like smushed together, banded together, classified together as a single object. But it doesn't make sense when you have lower resolution data. So like with a Landsat scene, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to conduct an object-based classification. You could do it, and that's basically what we have in the bottom left. This is like lower resolution data with an object-based versus pixel-based classification. But here, it doesn't really help as much using an object-based classification. With lower resolution, object-based classification just doesn't quite make as much sense. Many objects actually make up one pixel. So using a pixel-based classification is a better average approximation of what exists in that place. Using an object-based classification gives you kind of strange results. In the bottom left, we're doing an object-based classification of these different types of fields, but fields aren't really objects per se. So you can do it, but really we're just like representing different land cover types. In this case, it works out pretty well, but I'd still usually recommend pixel-based when you're looking at larger areas with lower resolution data. Object-based imagery analysis usually uses some of these machine learning techniques to understand the differences between objects. It's still an area of active research because some differences aren't really clear to computers still, and computers actually need human help to actually classify and make that final decision as to what belongs to what category. So this is a challenge data set I came across. Computer scientists who are trying to improve on classification techniques use data sets like this to try to improve their techniques. In this case, we're looking at a number of muffins and a number of chihuahuas. It turns out it's really difficult for a computer to tell the difference, and it's really challenging for an object-based classification technique to make this call as to which is which. So this object-based imagery analysis also requires a couple different steps. First is image segmentation. This is where pixels are grouped together into segments or objects with spectral similarity, but before classification occurs. So this is basically just saying where are different objects. In the figures at the top of the slide, we have a desert area with some shrubs, and we basically get the division of areas of desert and areas of shrubs identified. So everything becomes a distinct vector, but what those different areas are is not determined within this step, within the image segmentation. Then, as seen before, we have to actually classify these different objects. But in this case, we're assigning each object to a class. This is similar to those supervised classification methods. Usually they use those machine learning methods like support vector machines or decision trees, and not something like maximum likelihood classification. And that's because the machine learning techniques, like we saw with the random forest, you can actually input more variables and not just the spectral characteristics. So you can actually include things like not just color or reflectance, but also size, shape, texture, or relationship to neighbors. So in software that allows you to conduct this analysis, it's a little harder to do in ArcGIS. The big type of software that most people use for this is called eCognition. You can set rules manually that actually help the classifier along. You can say something like water is flat. We have these areas of water. I want to classify all the water. If an area is flat, it's more likely to be water. If an area has relief or elevation change, it's not going to be water. Water also exists in depressions. That means it's surrounded by higher elevation areas. It has lower temperature if you have one of these thermal bands that can measure temperature, and it has high absorption of spectral energy, low reflectance. So if you're classifying a building, you might not just use the spectral characteristics and how bright it reflects different wavelengths. You also might throw into the mix the fact that a building is usually going to be a rectangle or have sharp angles. It's flat on top, it's high slope, and it's taller relative to its surroundings. So you can actually input more rules that help your classifier along. Likewise, a tree might be something with high NDVI. So that is kind of one of those more traditional spectral variables that you'd look at. So usually object-based image analysis isn't carried out in ArcGIS, but it could according to the workflow on this slide. So first we have a segment image tool. Again, segmentation is just delineating where those different objects are. Second, you train the classifiers. There's similar options and similar classifiers to do this as with those pixel-based examples. You can use the ISO cluster, maximum likelihood, support vector machine. These are all possible to use at this stage. Then finally, you'd classify those different segmented areas. So just a couple final thoughts that relate to one or more of these different classification techniques. A lot of times the results can be messy, especially with these pixel-based techniques. There's a number of useful tools to be aware of for processing results, filtering results, and getting a cleaner output. So a lot of times you want to remove isolated pixels or smooth the boundaries of a class. You might get jagged edges to these different areas, or you might just get individual pixels out there all by themselves. There's two tools you want to use to do this. One is called majority filter. This removes those isolated pixels. It's a neighborhood methodology like we learned about in an earlier lecture. Each of those input pixels basically looks around itself at its neighboring pixels, sees what the most common value is, and the value of that pixel will change to what the most common surrounding value is. So if you have a class of 2 surrounded by a bunch of pixels that are in the class of 8, that class of 2 will change to 8. So it's pretty unlikely you'd have like a random 2 in the middle of a bunch of 8s. That might just be a misclassified pixel or some noise in the data. By using a majority filter, you'll just convert that over to like what's surrounding it. So you get a lot smoother output. And then boundary clean works in a similar way. It basically smooths the boundaries between two different classes. So after these two types of processing, you might proceed from an image like what's on the top left to one that looks more like it does on the top right. A lot of small areas are just kind of like eliminated from the visualization, and the boundaries of these different groups are smoother. Then finally, if you're like really seriously doing any of these classification techniques, you really should undertake an accuracy assessment. This compares the classified image to an image considered to be accurate on the ground. So you'd either like do kind of a heads-up accuracy assessment where you're turning on and off like a higher resolution data set with your classification output, or you'd actually want to like find some locations that are shown on your classification output and go out in the real world and check what land cover exists there, because you want to know how accurate your classification was. It's pretty unlikely your classification is going to be 100% accurate, but you want to like have confidence in how accurate it is. Usually like 80 to 85% accuracy is pretty acceptable for one of these classifications, but it is something that you just really have to like jot down and let people know about if you're disseminating one of these classifications. So a lot of times what you do is like assign a bunch of random points and then figure out how many of those random points the classified output corresponds to reality. So after you figure out like if those points correspond to reality or not, there's a number of different ways you can assess actual accuracy based on how many were correctly classified, how many were incorrectly classified, and how they were incorrectly classified. I'm actually not going to go too far into this right now. It's a little beyond the scope of today's lecture. But we use what's called a confusion matrix. This is basically how we assess misclassified pixels. And finally, we end up with something called a kappa coefficient. This is commonly used as kind of a judge of how good your classification is. I'll talk more about each of these in the actual remote sensing class in the future. Just know that if you are going on to do more remote sensing work in the future, these are important things that you will really have to do after any serious classification attempt.